Good morning. I'm Andre Sillier. I'll be your presenter today, and I'd like you to welcome all our guests and our viewers this morning to the TreasuryONE budget discussion. Now, the last 24 hours in South Africa has been very, very interesting. Not only have we had the budget, but we've also had interesting news out of Eskom regarding what happened there and Mr. De Ruyter. But our emphasis this morning will be on the budget discussion, which was far-reaching, not only for certain SOEs, but also for the individual and a lot of our viewers, and creates an atmosphere of confidence or non-confidence from investor side. So we're here to unpack it, and with me I have three esteemed guests. I have on my left-hand side Dr. Azar Yamin, George Glinos, and on my right-hand side I have Songezo Zibi, and I'd like to welcome them. They will be addressing us this morning. They will run through some presentations and discussions. On my left, once again, the two gentlemen will be handling more of the economic side, and Songezo will handle the political side. There will be a time for questions and answers, so during the presentation of each speaker, they will be able to not facilitate your questions immediately. They will do so at the end of their presentation. So please ask your questions. They will be relayed to me. I will see them, and then I will pose them at the end of the presentation to the various people. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Azar Yamin. He's published a number of articles in international strategic management journals and is a co-author of McGregor's Economic Alternatives, Trends Transforming South Africa and Mindset for the New Generation on South Africa, all published by Reuters. Dr. Yamin's contribution to McGregor's Economic Alternative was used by the ANC as a set work in the organization's internal training program prior to taking power in 1994. Dr. Yamin has presented papers on the South African economy at conferences in Washington, New York, London, Warsaw, Frankfurt, Paris, and Phuket. So a speaker of note and a well-established gentleman in our economic environment and community. Welcome to here this morning, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you very much to TreasuryONE for sponsoring this conference, and most importantly, welcome to all our clients at Econometrix and TreasuryONE who are attending this conference. For Econometrix, it's our 39th annual budget conference, so we're very proud of it, that it keeps being a hallmark of our business. The topic today, of course, is a question, as we have every year: how does the government balance its books in the context of the performance of the economy? And right now, clearly, the economy is not performing particularly well, which posed huge challenges to the government in presenting this budget. And in the context of that, I think Finance Minister Godongwana actually didn't do a bad job at all. What was very positive, I think, was overall, if you look at the numbers, the budget exuded a continuation of fiscal rectitude that has been in place under his leadership, which has been in contrast to the kind of budgets that were presented prior to his taking on office, certainly in one particular year during the era of state capture. As a consequence of this fiscal rectitude, the government has been able to reduce the budget deficit forecasts for the next few years, as well as the associated underlying public debt forecast. Individuals and companies will be gratified to know that there were no tax increases. On the contrary, there have been a few giveaways that will help to alleviate some of the pressures for social unrest without a doubt. With people suffering at the moment from load shedding, the concession given to individuals and companies to get tax deductions on investing in solar energy, I think will be very welcome. In addition, we've got the extension of those social relief grants that were first introduced with COVID-19 for those people who are unemployed and cannot access other forms of social grants. The social grants themselves received an inflation-related increase, so there's no giveaway there. But the extension of the special social grant is a giveaway. The third big issue is public servant remuneration, where the latest budget has a slightly higher projected increase in public servant remuneration than the previous ones. Very welcome from a structural point of view is the emphasis, quite a strong emphasis throughout the budget, if you go through the numbers, to try and switch away from focusing on empowering people to consume more towards investing more in the future of the country. And finally, we have the restructuring of Eskom's debt, which I think, and George Glinos will go into greater depth, but basically provides a greater opportunity for the energy crisis to be resolved by absorbing the private sector to be far more involved in this in the future. What are the question marks around this budget? The first one were the assumptions underlying the forecast growth in the economy sufficiently realistic, or are they overly optimistic? Question. Secondly, big emphasis on capital investment, but the question one asks is, will that public investment actually be forthcoming? Because for years we've seen many promises of such investment and no materialization thereof. The third one is, how will the government really manage to appease public servants in terms of its wage negotiations in a manner that sustains the rectitude of the current budget? And one can be gratified that the projection of budget deficits is that they come down gradually, but they're still in the region of 4 down to 3.5% of GDP, which is way in excess of the projected growth in the economy. So, it's a long way forward to try and actually bring down public debt under such circumstances. One might also ask, was there enough in this budget to deal with the structural weaknesses that the economy faces? Some will argue, well, in the context of a 50-minute budget speech, he couldn't cover all grounds, but I suppose people might say, well, did he do enough in terms of trying to address those structural reforms? What was very interesting, no mention of the National Health Insurance Scheme, land reform, nationalization of the Reserve Bank, and a basic income grant. All of these have been seen to be populist calls on part of certain factions within the ANC. No mention was made of them. Was that an effort to try and prevent people from being overly concerned and alarmed by those possibilities? Let's move on to, where do we start off with the economy? It's an unfortunate graph that I'm showing you here, because what it shows is that, and in fact one could take it back a long time, right through the 90s and first decade of the 21st century. I used to often show how closely correlated the fortunes of the South African economy were to that of the world on average. And then suddenly, from around 2012, 2013 onwards, what one sees is South Africa's economic growth performance starting to be far inferior to that of the world as a whole. And it is no coincidence that that began to take place around 2012, 2013. President Zuma came into office in 2009, and it's become a known fact that he embarked upon an absolutely brilliant program of state capture. And listening to the interview with Andre de Ruyter last night on ENCA and how state capture penetrated Eskom, I recognized that this was an absolutely brilliant way of a certain group of people actually managing to infiltrate all the major institutions in the country for their own particular benefit, but at the cost of transferring massive amount of resources from the economy itself towards their own pockets, depriving the economy of those resources. And that summarizes why the economy has been going downhill ever since around 2012, 2013, and underperforming. What are the structural weaknesses of the economy? Obviously, first and foremost, corruption, that, as I've mentioned, has swung resources way away from where they should be deployed. And the state-owned enterprises appear to have been the primary vehicle through which such corruption has been implemented. And clearly the most serious outcome of all this has been in the energy field, with the increased incidence of load shedding that is damaging economic growth. But it's not confined to that. We see how many other SOEs have also been collapsing. Obviously, the deterioration in our rail and port network through Transnet is also something to take into account there. And as the SOEs have become emaciated, so we've seen less and less investment being forthcoming, capital investment into the country, and whereas people have carried on consuming, and that's not a very sustainable program for longer-term economic growth. And the solution to underperformance of SOEs from within certain factions within the ruling party has been, we need government to intervene even more strongly and regulate even more strongly rather than free up the economy to the private sector. And a critical issue in the decline of the South African economy has been the tension between public and private sectors and the unwillingness of the government to embrace private sector involvement in improving the economy. And then on the other side, we've seen the whole concept of cadre deployment taking off with a vengeance in the past decade, leading to people being appointed in official positions incapable of actually being competent enough to fulfill the functions of those positions and to take decent decisions. And we've seen a decline, especially in municipal and provincial government, that has actually killed off a lot of economic activity. There's one very sinister structural weakness that has developed, well, it's been developing for many years, but is really reaching a bit of a climax more recently. And that is the deterioration in law and order. What one is finding is that a lot of the problems that we are finding in running the SOEs and many other areas of business are linked to the growth, the massive exponential growth of gangs and syndicates whose prime aim is to steal and bring down the functioning of a lot of the economy for their own benefit. And the police has proved to be incapable of actually controlling this, and the legal system has not been able to be effective enough in bringing such people to book. And this is really killing off a lot of economic activity. We saw it in the crime stats issued over the weekend, but we also see it in so many people of all color wanting to leave the country now because they don't see any future in what is becoming a potentially lawless society. And at the heart of all our problems that are not being addressed, of course, is the lack of decent education for the majority of people in the country, which contributes towards more and more inequality and the inability to find jobs because they can't add value to the economy. But in the shorter term, facing the budget, what the government was really against was this huge energy crisis. In this graph, I show you how the energy availability factor has been in consistent decline in recent years, to the point where less than half of available electricity capacity is now functional. And that has led to a situation where the amount of energy generated is up to 6,000 megawatts less than what the demand is. And the mind boggles as to what will happen in winter when the demand for electricity increases by about 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts from current levels. Then suddenly you are faced with a shortage of electricity generating capacity of anything up to 10,000, maybe even 12,000 megawatts. You're talking about an escalation in load shedding and potential real damage to the economy. That's the first big negative. The other big negative has been the deterioration in the transport network. I'll show you here two graphs which show you the reduction in freight rail traffic run by Transnet, and on the right hand side the exponential increase in the use of road haulage, especially to transport coal, at a time when coal prices have been at record levels and we've lost out nearly 100 billion rands worth of export opportunities as a consequence of that. I mentioned the whole issue of not enough investment relative to consumption, and that translates into an economy where the productive sector has been in decline relative to the consumptive sector, in direct conflict with the government's own objective, which is to re-industrialize the economy. I show you here in these two graphs mining production, manufacturing production. In both cases, you can see that we are at or below levels of production that prevailed in 2010. Those are the heartland productive side of the economy. Thank heavens for agriculture, which has been a star, because without that, production would have been still weaker in the economy. In contrast, if you go next page to the consumptive side, you can see that retail sales are up around 70% from where they were in 2010. And vehicle sales, amazingly, during these tough times have been doing extremely well. But that speaks to the distortion in the way in which this economy works, where people are only too keen to just consume, and are not investing sufficiently into the future. And it's in that is one of the issues that the government faced in presenting this budget. Another way of looking at it is you can see from the accompanying graph that the red line is GDP. GDP is now higher than it was 3 years ago at the time of the outbreak of COVID-19. But on the other side, employment is down still about 4 to 5% compared with where it was then. And worse still, investment is down 12% compared with where it was at the time of COVID-19. That is not a recipe for higher economic growth. So that is the context in which the Godongwana actually faced this budget. He has, however, been blessed with an overrun in government revenue in the last couple of years due to extremely high mineral prices, which have enabled a lot of mining companies to rake in huge profits and pay a lot of taxes. I present to you here the forecasts upon which government has been basing this latest budget, and they are looking to economic growth of 0.9% for this year and around 1.5% for next year and the year thereafter. And one of the big questions that needs to be posed, and there is no clear answer, are these forecasts too optimistic? The Reserve Bank came out with a forecast a few weeks ago saying just 0.3% growth for this year and 0.7% for next year, well below what the Treasury itself has forecast. And the obvious reason for this is that they have assumed an increase in the intensity of load shedding. And if economic growth turns out to be that much lower, then of course growth in government revenue may well turn out to be quite a bit lower. The reason that the government would give for being slightly more optimistic is that they have assumed that quite a lot of this infrastructural investment that they have built into the budgets and that they've been talking about for a number of years. Ramaphosa has given us very strong investment figures time and again, which have failed to be implemented. The hope is that just some of this might start seeing the light of day. Most notably, of course, in the adoption of renewable energy, investment in renewable energy. And now we have the possible purchase of solar panels and solar investment, a new, very fast-growing industry in South Africa that might just help to lift economic growth to over 1% over the next couple of years. On the other side, we also have the challenge of the world economy. The forecast is also based on the assumption that commodity prices will remain reasonably strong, and so we will be able to carry on raking some of this benefit of the overrun of government revenue, although the government has assumed a slight deterioration in the which is based in commodity prices, which is based on recent evidence of a slowdown in the world economy. If the world economy were to slow down particularly sharply as a result of higher interest rates, then the impact could be much worse and the revenue take much lower than anticipated. In the current table, I show you, especially the right-hand column, the breakdown of the overrun in billions of rands of government revenue compared with what had been budgeted for a year ago. And the figure now is estimated at 94 billion rand overrun compared with what was budgeted in February 2022, with company tax, especially from mining companies, taking the lion's share thereof at 75 billion of those 94 billion. The question is, can that actually be sustained in the context of a slowdown in the world economy? If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that the assumption that the government has made is that it will be sustained. 94 billion for the current fiscal year. For next fiscal year, if you look at the top line, they're budgeting for an overrun compared with February 2022 of 93 billion. For that, for 23-24, for 24-25, an overrun of 100 billion rand compared with what was budgeted for in February last year. So they have assumed that this bonanza may create a higher base from which to continue into the future. There is another element thereof that I think needs to be highlighted, that was mentioned by the Minister yesterday, and that is the improvement in government's revenue collections. And clearly they're hoping that Edward Kieswetter will continue being highly successful in his efforts to raise more revenue. But those are the question marks that need to be posed. I'm not saying they are invalid. I'm just questioning whether in fact they are will materialize, especially when you look at the next couple of charts, which show you how the boom in commodity prices that was seen from 2019 through to 2021 started fading away in 2022, and in particular on the right hand side, the sharp decline in coal prices internationally, and that's one area where we gained a hell of a lot of extra revenue. So again, it's questioning the ability of the government to raise all that revenue. Assuming that they do meet their revenue targets, then you see their budget deficit forecasts are actually very, very attractive. And if you look at the bottom line of the budget deficits that have been presented in each 6 consecutive budget, medium-term budget policy statement, budget, medium-term budget policy statement, and budget, you'll see that those figures have been declining progressively. Very nice. For example, for 2022-23, 2 years ago we were forecasting a budget deficit of 7.3% of GDP. In October last year with the MTBPS, it was 4.9%, it's now 4.2%. And the same argument goes for the next couple of years. And that is what is, on the face of it, perceived to be a fiscal rectitude, and would, to some extent, reassure markets that the government is not embarking upon a major program of populism. And a couple of the graphs show you here the budget balance. The green line is the most recent, is yesterday's budget. The yellow line is what was presented in the MTBPS, and the other ones are what the old forecasts were. And you can see how the budget deficit has been reduced. Even more attractive has been the manner in which we are now in a situation of running a fiscal surplus. In other words, one of the reasons why we're having to borrow more is simply to fund the interest paid on our cumulative borrowings and debt. And what we are now seeing is that even taking, if you take that element out of the picture, we are actually receiving more money, more tax revenue than we are spending, which is what most economists would aspire to as a signal of fiscal rectitude. And that is set to carry on improving over the next few years. In other words, once you take into account interest paid on public debt, we are actually now getting more tax revenue in, or budgeting to get more tax revenue in than spending. If you look at the debt to GDP projection, you'll say, oh, but hey, look, this time around the debt to GDP is rising compared with what was presented in October. But that is purely a function of government transferring 254 billion rand over the next 3 years of Eskom's debt onto its own balance sheet. And that, of course, 254 billion translates into about 3.5% of GDP. And that is why the projected public debt now peaks at 73.6% in 25-26 instead of 70% as previously budgeted for. It's purely a function of Eskom. If you took out the Eskom factor, there would have been an earlier peak in the public debt to GDP. And that translates into a similar situation with debt servicing costs, where you see the green line here. Well, debt servicing costs have progressively been budgeted to fall as a percentage of GDP, but you can see that in relation to the MTBPS, which is the yellow line, the green line now projects a slightly higher debt servicing costs, which is a manifestation of the fact that with government now taking some of that, quite a lot of that Eskom debt onto its own balance sheet, it is now responsible for paying the interest on that debt. But really, at the end of the day, from a financial point of view, it doesn't make a huge difference, because it means that Eskom will be less pressured to increase tariffs on consumers as steeply as it has been doing. But on the other side, consumers or taxpayers will actually be burdened with that money, rather than those who consume electricity. It's really a case of taking from Peter to pay Paul. So from that point of view, it's not a big deal. George will talk about the broader ramifications of the Eskom debt restructure. I want to come to the other big question the two other big questions that one poses. The ability of the government to actually get away with very low rates of increase in public servant remuneration. You can see here that the projected growth in the top line of the top table, projected growth in remuneration of employees over the next few years, 3.8% for the past year, for the current fiscal year, 1.6%, 3.9%, 4.4%. Yet the projected inflation rate is in the region of 4.5% to 5%. So the government is banking on absorbing less or paying out less on remuneration than the actual overall budget. And will it get away with that with the public sector unions? In fact, currently there are negotiations going on, and the figures that are being mooted are 4.7% for this year, and inflation-linked increases for next year and the year thereafter, which would be around 4.5%, 5%, which would be higher than the numbers that the government has budgeted for. And I've done the calculation myself, and what it actually amounts to is, if we were to
if the government were to pay out the increases that are currently being negotiated, it would amount to somewhere between 22 and 30 billion rand extra for each of the next 3 years. Now that's about 0.3, 0.4% of GDP that would need to be added onto the budget deficit, which is material. But at the same time, it's not completely frightening. And I think the markets and the credit ratings agencies might be forgiving if that was the limit to which the public sector wage bill were increased, because they would see the trade-off between having social and industrial peace in the country vis-a-vis a slightly higher borrowing requirement. The second big question to ask is whether the optimism with regard to fixed capital formation will actually materialize. If you look at the third line, expenditure on capital assets, you can see the growth from year to year, 11.7, 20.4, 13.2, 9.9%, way above inflation. And in the bottom one, as a percentage of total expenditure, the bottom chart, you'll see the third line showing you how capital expenditure by the government is forecast to grow from 4.2 all the way to 5.6% of overall expenditure over the next 3 years. Some will argue that's not enough, but the point is the direction is we're going in the correct direction. The big question is, will the government actually spend that money come when the time comes? In the next slide, I'll show you the breakdown of public sector investment projected for the next 3 years. And the good news is, if you look at the red figures and then latest, is the cumulative capital expenditure projected over the next 3 years is going up from the 812 billion that was budgeted for in the MTBPS to 903 billion in this latest budget. That's a significant increase of about of 90 billion rand on what was being projected in October. You can see much of it, more than a third of it is on transport and logistics, the other is on energy, water and sanitation, around 15, 17% each, and then the other smaller areas of expenditure. And in the bottom half of the table, you can see that about a third of it is due to be spent by state-owned enterprises, and 23% by provincial departments and 21% by municipalities. But, you know, we've been promised such expenditure in the past. The direction is certainly in the right way, but will that come to fruition, especially when you have such challenges such as the construction mafia and the breakdown in law and order that sees cable theft and syndicates actually sabotaging so many of the infrastructural investment issues. So that is the next big question about this budget. Look, it's well intended, but will it actually materialize? And talking of law and order, I then look at on the next graph at the next table at the projected average annual growth rates in the different areas of government spending. And you'll see that law and order is only 2.7% per year. The police is 3.7% specifically, which is a bit higher. But the processing of criminals only gets votes of 1.6% or thereabout. So you can see, you know, where's the government having to save money on learning and culture, healthcare, etc., and redirecting that towards community development, that's building houses and recreational facilities, and towards economic development, infrastructure. But other areas are having to lose out, such as critical areas, healthcare, education, and policing. Big challenge. And you can see how one of the highest rates of growth goes to paying interest on a very elevated level of public debt. And that is the challenge that we face. How do we bring down that debt in such a way as to conserve money that is currently being directed at interest payments towards more effective forms of expenditure for society. Let me turn finally to the tax changes, and these, I suppose, are very satisfactory for the man in the street and for businesses. You can see that there has been virtually total relief, although George is questioning whether it's quite as magnanimous as made out to be the case. You know, as you get a salary increase in line with inflation, you move up the tax ladder. And what the government has done is said that they are adjusting those tax tables so that you don't end up actually paying a higher tax rate on what you earn than previously. And that the giveaway there is about 15 billion rand. In other words, the government anticipates it will get 15 billion rand more from individuals because of inflation, but then it's adjusting for that through higher tax brackets that way. And then you see the cost of solar installations, 4 billion rand that the government is giving away in the case of individuals, and 5 billion rand in the case of businesses. And again, George will speak to that a little. It's most welcome, no question about it. The other giveaway has been in regard to the fuel levy, where for the second consecutive year there has been no increase in the fuel levy, and that has meant that the government has forfeited 4 billion rand from what it might otherwise have got there. There has also been the extension of the diesel rebate to help limit the increase in food prices from food producers who benefit from that diesel rebate. So again, the government is trying to minimize the potential for social unrest by giving some concessions to people in regard to energy shortage, in regard to fuel prices, and in regard to food prices. And of course, the other one is the extension of the social grant, special social grant that was fully expected, that is set to cost an additional 36 billion rand. At the end of the day, the total concessions given to individuals is 13 billion rand out of 1.79 trillion rand. Okay, you know, yeah, it's a small benefit, but it is a little benefit. And the next table shows you the share of the tax by different sources, and the biggest change that you see is that the growth in revenue from the fuel levy is set to decline quite sharply from 5.7 to 4.7% of total tax take, and all the other areas such as personal tax, company and VAT see a slight increase in their share of the total tax take. In conclusion, no question positive, the government sticking to fiscal discipline, and but one questions whether the discipline is based on premises that are maybe too optimistic in terms of how much growth there will be in the economy in the face of load shedding and weakening global economy, and whether they'll get enough revenue to actually meet their fiscal commitments. Encouragement from the absence of tax increases. Question, will infrastructural projects be implemented? You know, that could be a game changer, and that is the solution to the country's low growth rates. If we really started spending the hundreds of billions of rands that have been earmarked for infrastructure, you would improve service delivery and create jobs and resolve our fiscal problems all at once. That would be the game changer. Will Eskom's debt restructure see greater embrace of the private sector by the government? One would like to think so. And then my final comment, just a brief one that George will spend more time on, is the impact on financial markets. I think is relatively neutral to possibly marginally positive. The big overhanging question that we face there the next 24 hours is whether the economy will be, and the financial sector will be grey listed or not, which falls outside of the ambit of the budget. And there are questions as to whether the full effects of that grey listing have already been discounted in the markets or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raza Yamin. I think very enlightening. I was listening, and the one thing that you speak to about is the positiveness of an additional 90 billion rands on infrastructure spending. But I think very closely on that, on the lips of many a person in South Africa, is the corruption that could possibly be linked to that, the tender processes that could be flawed, and will it really add anything new, or is it just really a replacement of dilapidated and destructed infrastructure that we currently sit with? So will it really add value? And will additional controls, in your opinion, or in any, I put it to the panel, be implemented to avoid a construction mafia and tender processes being rigged, etc., so that it is effective spending?
You're absolutely correct, and that is why I try to highlight the essential need to address the deterioration in law and order, because without that, all these numbers are just complete hearsay. They're of academic importance. They won't bear any fruit. What was encouraging to hear explicitly the Minister of Finance saying that the government intends to focus not only on investment in new capital, but on investment in maintenance of existing infrastructure. That he did explicitly mention that, and that is to be welcomed. But I cannot be more positive than that, and to say with unequivocal confidence that, in fact, the processes will be put in place to try and preempt corruption and state capture and the mafia and the sabotage that is taking place.
George, any view from?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to maybe just add in that we are still fortunate in this country that we have a free press. Sengezo can speak to that a little bit more, but we still have free press. Last night's interview with Dorito kind of speaks to that. But so we get to unearth a lot of problems that are happening in South Africa, and I think that's obviously useful. The second is that we have a constitutional democracy, and that constitutional democracy, it may not be perfect, but it has held up quite well in the face of a concerted state capture effort. So much so that we've even had Jacob Zuma, although not for the right reasons, land up in jail, at least temporarily. We'll see if he lands up in jail more long-term, perhaps later this year. Maybe not. But the point is that civil society has been able to hold on to that constitutional democracy, and they've been able to take the fight to some of these politicians and to the political elite. And so in so doing, I think they have prevented plenty. And, lest we forget about a lot of the state capture incidents that have happened through the course of the past 5-6 years. The whole talk around radical economic transformation, all of those, that narrative, that push along those lines towards things like the NHI, nuclear deals with the Russians. There are many that we can speak of that have amounted to nothing. And I think that's a bit of a success story for South Africa, and one that we can be proud of. It's potentially saved South Africa from turning into a failed state. And so I'd like to just point that out, because as I'm probably going to allude to in my portion of the presentation, South Africa has grown, albeit far less than anticipated, in spite of government, not because of it. And it's been able to do that in extremely challenging circumstances, which, again, it sounds peculiar to say, but it's almost a success story in itself. So yes, we've got problems. I think your point on corruption is obviously a valid one, but we must trust in what we've got in the backgrounds to also just perhaps prevent it from sliding into something more like a failed state. Yeah, I don't know. Sangezo, on the political front?
Well, I mean, I've always wondered over the years whether the Treasury's GDP growth projection is isn't political in a way, because as you were speaking, Dr. Yamin, I was wondering whether if the modeling had been done on the Reserve Bank's projection of economic growth, whether all the other ratios then that we're talking about and thinking more optimistically about, whether it would look as good as it does, because you do have two institutions related to one another, one more optimistic and the other less optimistic. There's something I've always called the price of political choices, which is if you plot the finance minister's GDP projection at budget speech each year since 2007, and what it's actually become, the net result at the end of each year. The Treasury has always been consistently optimistic about what the annual GDP growth is going to be, which says to me there are underlying assumptions about how well the political system is going to perform in order to produce the GDP outcome they envisage is generally optimistic. So, I come to the same conclusion as you, right, in terms of this budget, but I temper my assessment because of the political equation, basically.
Just to allay that cynicism slightly, the reality, ironically, for the past year contradicts what
right, for the past year.
Because a year ago, the government budgeted for the economy to grow by 1.9%, and it's actually grown by 2.5%, we think, this year. I'm just putting that in.
Long may it continue.
I'd like to put you a little bit on the spot. Dr. Yamin alluded to the 3-point-something% for the police, which is not that much, but the minister also said that they will employ 5,000 more recruits per year over the next 3 years. But he also mentioned our bad educational system. Does that not feed through to the police force in the quantity of students that they get that is supposed to be combating crime for us in future? If their education that they got at school is so bad, how do we rectify that?
No, I think the law enforcement problem is a slightly different one, because I think what we have destroyed over the last decade and a bit is the capacity to identify, track and prosecute the really complicated financial crimes, right? And that's not just tax evasion and so on, but actually the ability of people to extract money out of the system and then dissipate it in cash and so on. The stuff that we had in the State Capture Commission coming out about how politicians and business people were accessing huge amounts of cash. That should not be happening on that scale. I think the problem is that between the prosecutors, the forensic investigators, the detectives and so on, you've got two problems. The overwhelming caseload, first of all, and secondly, really underwhelming capacity to identify and prosecute such crimes. I don't think that is necessarily a problem of whether you're able to get the right quality of cop at constable on street beat level. Sure, that has an impact, but I think the bigger worry I have is the ability to identify the kind of people that Dr. Jamin was talking about in terms of your construction mafia, your road freight mafia, and so on. Where does that money go? Where's the intelligence to track, find those people and lock them up and then prosecute them? I think that's missing, and that's a bigger concern for me.
Thank you. I think we have to move on to our next esteemed guest, George. I have a little thing here about you. It says that you're very old because you've got 27 years of experience as an economist. So it must, being an economist in South Africa, 27 years, you can almost double that and say it's 54 years because every day is a new day in this country at the moment. But aside from the experience as an economist, George has been consulting in the financial market environment as at ETM Analytics, and they also conduct a range of companies and consults to a range of companies and funds of all sizes and shapes. in all different spheres of the economic strategy. George, as head of the research of the ETM group, revolves more around the global macro themes. He's a speaker of note. He focuses a little bit on what happens to our currency. So let's take the advantage of George's knowledge and hear what he's got to say to us. And once again, I'm just going to say to everybody, please, there is a place where you can leave your questions and send it through to us. We welcome that and we'd love to handle that at the end of George's presentation. George, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. It's wonderful to be here this morning. I'm really quite enjoying this format. I hope the viewers are seeing it as well. And on behalf of ETM Analytics as well as Econometrix, thank you to TreasuryONE for hosting us this morning. I really hope that our clients are getting good benefit out of this. And I hope that I add a little bit of something different to the discussion and the presentation this morning. There is a little bit of crossover in what Azar has said naturally. I think we both see the same events unfolding, and there's commonality in the way that we are viewing things at the moment. So naturally, we're going to be touching on very similar themes, but perhaps I'm going to look at it a little differently. So it goes without saying that every budget I have been asked historically to give an assessment out of 10 as to what I thought of this budget, and this year I've chosen to give it a solid 5.5 out of 10. It doesn't sound particularly brilliant, but we need a little bit of context here. There was a few years ago when I used to do these presentations at the Econometrix budget breakfasts, and I think I had Azar sweating a little bit because my scores out of 10 back then, when Pravin Gordhan was still finance minister, were a very paltry 2 and 3 out of 10, and in some cases I was quite tempted to give it a 1. And so the 5.5, believe it or not, is probably the strongest reading that I've given a budget in some 10 years, if not more. So it is saying something that I've at least given it a pass. It comes off last year's 5 out of 10, which I guess is a mild improvement. And perhaps what I should do now is just take the viewers through some of my thinking as to why it even got a slight upgrade on a year ago. So the first slide really is just a summary of my likes and dislikes. And I think probably the most important part of what I enjoyed with this budget, and I think it's long overdue, and you see the theme coming through repeatedly, is I'm getting a sense that government is finally understanding the need, the necessity to crowd in the private sector to find the solutions to the country's problems. So, but for far too long, we've had this ideological position within the ruling party that we've had to be statist in the way that we've gone about things, centralized control, bigger government, throw more resources at a problem when it arises, as I alluded to, even more interventionism. I was speaking to Songezo a little bit earlier, and we were saying I've interacted with some of the ANC elite, and the sense that I got was that they didn't accept that the problem was so much a problem of policy as much as it was about implementation at a government level. And so ultimately, the fact that we are considering diversifying some of that power and decentralizing the influence within the economy to the private sector, I think is a massive positive. Long overdue, but a massive positive. There were other aspects within this budget which I viewed also positively. There was a clear effort on the part of government to focus on investment. Investment, as I'm going to show you in the next slide, has been a little lacking. And it's been especially lacking from government side rather than the private sector. The private sector has actually held up, given the circumstances, remarkably well. It's the public sector that has let this economy down, and where the dip in investment has taken place. So they have looked to try and de-risk some projects, for example. through blended finance schemes, through getting the Development Bank of South Africa involved to take on some of the debt, but also to introduce easier financing options in a bid to try and encourage, make the playing field one where it's a little more constructive and will attract that level of investment. They've introduced things like research and development incentives, which I think is a positive step forward. You get material tax incentives and tax breaks for being able to invest into things like R&D. So those are fantastic. And I think the other big improvement in this particular budget for me is that we've reduced the risk now of a possible Eskom default. There was a lot of concern, at least within the markets, that there was going to be cross-contamination from Eskom into other SOEs. And at the very least, by removing a big chunk, that 254 billion away from Eskom, at least we've de-risked that situation. So anyone concerned that Eskom would be heading down the road of default can now relax a little bit. That risk has been mitigated to quite a significant degree. The other thing that I enjoyed was the idea of incentives, both for households and businesses. Now, the household one is a bit small, to be honest. I would have liked to have seen an incentive of larger magnitude to entice people to put solar on their roofs and whatnot. Capping it at a maximum of 15,000 Rand, I think, is a little bit soft. They could have been a bit bolder on that. But what was more interesting for me was to see the incentive at a business level. And I'll touch on that in a few slides' time. But that business level, I think, was a material step forward. What I didn't like about this budget is that, once again, we are faced with debt levels rising. Now, as I spoke about a few years ago, we were actually staring at debt levels peaking at 90-odd%. Well, through some very clever re-engineering of the data and GDP suddenly being 20% bigger and a whole bunch of numbers being restated, that dropped a good 20%. So overnight, we went from peaking at levels around 90-95%, which were stressing a lot of us within the financial markets out. We've now dropped down to levels of 70. 70 is high, but it's manageable. But the point is that we're starting to nudge up again. And the nudging up is very much a function of the great balance sheet roll-up, going from state-owned enterprises up into the public balance sheet. And that concerns me because it's not a new trend. We've been doing this for a while. Think about the amount of bailouts that SAA received. Think about the amount of bailouts that many state-owned enterprises have received, including things like the SABC, Post Office, and others. And so that's just a continuation of a trend, except that obviously this time it's a lot bigger because Eskom, just as a problem, is a lot bigger. The interest on debt remains high and, as I indicated, rising a little bit. So it's still diverting funds away from more productive uses, which I think perturbs me still to some degree. Revenue expectations, they're looking reasonably good. But as I indicated, and as Songezo pointed out, I mean, I'm not quite sure what economy they're looking at, because from where I sit, I look at stage 6 load shedding being an extreme case that we're living through right now. I've even got the sense that South Africa is already in a technical recession, although we're not going to get the numbers for a few more months, because we simply can't grow with stage 6 load shedding. It's just not possible, and I'm going to show you a graph that speaks to that. So I think our GDP expectations need to be lowered, and fairly significantly. I would buy far more closely into the Reserve Bank's forecast than I would into National Treasury's forecast. It almost feels like a forecast that got done maybe in November or December last year, not one that's been done more recently. And so that would be one big comment that I would have on that. And then it's just to highlight the point. Why does it always have to take a crisis of this magnitude before government and policymakers respond? So let's just jump into some of the context and move on to the next slide. And I spoke about the disappointing trends that we've seen in things like fixed investment. When you have a look at your investment to GDP ratios, back in the days of Trevor Manuel in 06, 07, 08, Back in those days, we tipped the scales at around 21% investment to GDP, and I distinctly remember Trevor Manuel saying, as a country, we need to be targeting 25% investment, 25% of GDP. That's what we need to aim for. And we were cheering him on at the time because we were running budget surpluses. We were looking so good. We were paying down debts. Our debt to GDP ratios were down in the low 20s. We were in a virtuous cycle that felt so good. And at the time, South Africa was really booming. We were able to hit growth rates of 5.5% and 6%. And that virtuous cycle was wonderful. Come the financial crisis, and that's what started the rot. And then we had the Jacob Zuma lost decade, as it's become known. And through that lost decade, we all know what's happened. But the reduction in investment as a percent of GDP has accelerated more in the past 5-6 years. Now, I know there's often a characterization of Cyril Ramaphosa, being the man that has presided over the deindustrialization, if you like, of South Africa. But really, this is a problem that started long before Ramaphosa. This is a function of the lagged effects of all the state capture that we've seen up until now. And Ramaphosa, and perhaps I'm not his biggest fan, but and I think he could have done a whole lot more. But I don't know that anyone could have accomplished too much more, given the political realities, which I'm sure Songezo will speak to. So really, this has been a budget that's taken place against the backdrop of state-owned enterprise underperformance. And so the very first chart that I'd like to just highlight here is just to show you what's happened to what we call SA seaborne cargo, and you see how that's just dropped off fairly significantly, and from around mid-21 onwards, Transnet started to underperform fairly significantly, and that's impacted very directly on South Africa's ability to export as effectively and efficiently as we would like. Equally, and as I alluded to this, I know you had a chart on there a little bit earlier where you spoke about the shift from rail to road. And I think we need to appreciate just how devastating this is. Now, one man's crisis is another man's opportunity, and of course, the road freight industry has just catapulted in size and become far more significant, and that's wonderful. Thank goodness we've got there. But there are unintended consequences of not being able to use rail, and that is the destruction of South Africa's roads infrastructure. It was never designed to cope with the amount of freight that's being trucked across our roads. And so the one thing that I would highlight about a budget like this is that we might look at these numbers at a very from a top-down perspective, but on the ground there are very real consequences for the lost decade that I'm referring to. And so you talk about the budget and fiscal consolidation and all of that, but you know that lurking in the wings are these unfunded liabilities that just haven't come to fruition. Now, people would argue, but we already see the potholes everywhere, George, that's nothing new. But I'm talking about it on a broader scale. At the moment, we've got our main arterial roads are still looking okay, they're still pretty good. Imagine when those start to deteriorate faster than government can replace them because we're not using rail as we should and we're utilizing the roads instead. All of a sudden, it paints a different picture on what that need to spend on infrastructure looks like. Then, of course, moving on to the chart of my day, which is the Eskom chart. As I alluded to, the energy availability factor. This is kind of a similar chart, but I talk about it in terms of electricity intensity of the South African economy. So it's really electricity production as a percent of GDP. And you just, or as a ratio to GDP, and you just see that falling off a cliff. And it's just been a steady decline, which, if anything, has started to accelerate now more recently. And of course, with stage 6 at the start of this year, we almost feel like we're going off a cliff, and it's quite disappointing. Now, the obvious knock-on implications for this is that, well, no economy anywhere in the world can grow without electricity. And so this electricity situation is a crisis of biblical proportions that South Africa urgently needs to deal with. You will see on the slide that I have added a link, because I think it's critically important for everybody to watch this interview. But Annika Larsen interviewed Andre de Ruyter on the unfolding crisis that is Eskom at the moment. And if you ever wanted to understand what unscrambling an egg looks like, that's probably a good analogy to describe what's going on at Eskom. They have got major problems, and it's political, it's embedded corruption, it's ineptitude, it's a loss of skills, it's vested interests, it's just so much all rolled into one. It's actually quite difficult to understand how the problem can be resolved, and yet Andre de Ruyter did offer some ways of resolving this crisis, and again it defaulted more to the allowance of the private sector to play a far bigger role, and for Eskom to focus quite specifically on transmission and distribution rather than generation, which I think is a very important point to make, because if I flip over to the next chart, electricity generation is an absolute must if this country is ever to reclaim its status as an emerging market worth paying attention to. So when I have a look at ratios of energy consumption and GDP per capita, there's a very, very clear regression line that you can draw straight through all these different examples and countries, where quite typically what you would see is that your higher income countries and those with higher GDP per capita are obviously consumers of energy. Now, what is the chicken? It's a bit of a chicken or the egg. Is it that you need the electricity to grow, or is that you're a wealthy country so that you can afford to purchase the electricity? I would say I think they go hand in hand, and you can't have one without the other. And so this proves beyond any reasonable doubt why it's so important for South Africa to resolve this electricity crisis. Now, one might look at this and say, well, our primary energy consumption per capita is actually reasonably high compared to other countries of similar GDP per capita. But I would point out that South Africa, by virtue of the kind of economy that it is, it's a commodity-driven economy, it utilizes electricity quite intensively, quite different from a country, for example, like Switzerland, which is very much a service-driven economy, or Ireland, for example, much more service-driven economy, where the intensity of the usage of electricity is far, far lower. So electricity, absolutely critical to South Africa if any growth and productivity is to come. And naturally, and again, I double up on a chart that, as I showed a little bit earlier, but he did allude to the long-standing trend that existed, or the correlation that existed between South African growth and growth of the rest of the world. And we used to move in lockstep up until about 2012, 2013, when state capture really got going. The SOEs, cadre deployment, kind of destroyed the institutional integrity that took place there. Corruption ran rampant. SOEs performed poorly. Bailouts began. Productivity within these SOEs just started to decline fairly significantly. And the net result is you've had the jaws of the crocodile, if you like, opening wider and wider, the jaws being a barometer for the level of underperformance of South Africa relative to the rest of the world. We should have been doing so much better had it just not been for the failures of state. So then again, such a dire backdrop like I've just painted, then, why have I given this the strongest score in a decade? And I think it's worth just going through some of the reasons for that. And some of the reasons for that are, of course, the first and foremost, the alleviation of debt at an Eskom level. 254 billion taken off Eskom's balance sheet. That is a fairly enormous amount that's going to take place over 3 years. 180 odd of that is going to be in the way of actual redemptions that government is going to take over. A further 70 on top of that is going to be the government taking on the interest on some of that debt. So that's fairly significant. It reduces as I said, the risk of an Eskom default, which is positive and allows more funding for things like maintenance and the use of diesel. The other positive thing about that is that it came with a very strict set of conditions. And I have highlighted some of those conditions, and I'll get onto that in the very next slide, where we talk about the oversight of Eskom to ramp up. So the first thing that they're going to do is bring an international panel of coal-fired power stations, so people with extensive experience in these kinds of power stations to come and do a due diligence and a full-blown assessment on South Africa's power plants. They will then decide which plants need to be shut down, that simply cannot be repurposed, and in other words, when we're looking at it on a bank for buck basis, which plants are worth resuscitating and which plants are better left alone. There are some plants like Tutuka, as we heard last night, that are problem children, because no matter how hard Eskom tries, they are only operating at something like 10 or 15% of their installed capacity. Well, something like that, why are we spending so much money trying to resuscitate a plant which is producing so little and which has been so difficult to get right, when other plants with a lot less effort could be producing more effectively than that? So that's the first thing. Eskom's going to be required to implement the recommendations that come from that independent panel. And it's not going to be a softly approach. They've been given an ultimatum: you implement them or you're gone. So it's a case of the implementing of recommendations, and Eskom is then going to concession those power stations to get fixed up. So I think those are all positive developments. Then on top of that, some of the further restrictions are going to come in the form of funding that is restricted. So no longer is Eskom going to be fully in charge of its own finances. It's very much a case of abuse and you lose. So you abused your privilege of being able to handle your own finances. Well, now you lost the privilege altogether, and National Treasury is going to determine how and when you utilize your funding. So let me give you some example. Only minimum emissions capital expenditure can be undertaken for generation. So effectively they're saying for new generation plants, only minimum emissions capital expenditure will be allowed. Now, that is effectively to facilitate the green energy push for solar, wind, and the likes. No other greenfield investments will be allowed while in the debt relief period, which is going to last for 3 years. So no other greenfield investments. I read that, I understood that to mean no nuclear power station build within that time. So I think let's put that to rest once and for all. No new borrowing is allowed while under the debt relief period. So Eskom's not going to be able to borrow more than what it has already borrowed, and I think that's fairly significant. So they are going to be forced to run within the parameters of their finances, given that government has effectively taken so much of the debt off their plate. They will be rendered in a position where they'll be able to make a small profit even after the servicing of debt, which means that they are now on a sustainable path. So there is no need for them to borrow more. They need to extract what efficiencies they can. Any relief of non-core assets, the sale of non-core assets, can only go into reducing the level of debt or for paying interest on that debt. So again, not to be utilized for any purposes that could be deemed corrupt. So I thought that was positive. And then the final one was any remuneration agreements, and I thought this was a message to the unions to say any remuneration agreements cannot impact Eskom's financial position negatively. In other words, you can ask for whatever you like, but if it deteriorates the position of Eskom's finances, it's not going to be allowed. Another reason that I thought this was positive was that we have electricity incentives, incentives for both the households and the private sector to invest into solar. Households get an incentive of 4 billion in total. Whether it all gets utilized or not, I'm not sure. When I heard the incentive, 15,000 rand maximum is better than nothing for sure. But when you realize the kind of rigmarole that you're going to need to go through in order to claim back the 15,000, you start asking yourself whether it's worth that kind of effort and the 18-month lag that's probably going to take in order for that to happen. More significant to me was the business incentive. So the business incentive was quite an interesting one. So now businesses can claim up to 125% of the expenditure on solar, and they can do that in their first year. So if I give you an example, if you spent 1 million rand on solar, you'd be able to claim back 1.25 million against that expenditure, which at the current corporate tax rate means that you get an immediate benefit of around 337,000 rand, and that's in the first year. Now that is an incentive that I think is useful. It's uncapped. They've earmarked an amount of 5 billion, but from what I understand, it's uncapped, which means big malls, for example, buildings that are being managed, just about any green solar energy expansion onto business can be claimed quite successfully, and I think that is a meaningful incentive. So I think that's a positive that I would like to point out. And then again, like I said, there's a very clear incentive, a very clear effort to try and include the private sector. Now, inclusion of the private sector is an interesting one because I think they would get very strong pushback, and we've already seen the unions muttering about this push towards selling of state assets that I want to see it. So this is more of a privatization by stealth, if you like. It's a privatization more through the liberalization of some of these network industries than it is about physically selling assets. So it's not about selling assets, it's just about allowing the private sector to play a role and for the state-owned enterprises to gradually shrink the size of their footprint within those industries, which I think is a wonderful idea. The encouragement of investment I've already spoken about, as I have the de-risking of projects and R&D. The final one to mention is that they're talking about competition incentives. So competition incentives, I think, is potentially another positive one. So all in all, there were some positives to take out of this budget, and for that reason, it got a 0.5 point improvement on my overall score out of 10. There are, however, implications, and the implications are very clear. As I've spoken about the step change towards the debt to GDP, I've listed the borrowing requirements for those that want to read them off the screen. They do ramp up fairly strongly over the next 3 years. There are implications for how that's going to be funded, and I'm going to touch on that in the very next slide, which perhaps we can switch to now, so that you can understand what we're looking at. Now, this looks like a busy table, but really I've highlighted the most important parts of this. In that top block, you will see the debt relief arrangement and how much the government is going to be taking off Eskom's balance sheet. You talk about 78 billion in the first year, 66 billion in the second, and 110 in the third. This is what effectively it amounts to when you consider the interest payments and all of that. So all of that I think is generally positive. If one has a look at how that's going to get funded, well, you'll be interested to note that it's not going to be a huge reliance on issuing government bonds. They're going to tap different sources. Perhaps the most significant is that they're going to tap changes in cash balances in the first couple of years, and then tap foreign lending in the latter years. So that's how they're going to construct most of that, to keep the impact on the bond market to a minimum. it will at least constrain the degree to which interest rates at a bond yield level rise too far. The other implication, and I'm not going to go on this too long because as I was already touched on it, but you can see the upward shift in the bottom right chart of our summary of this budget, and you can see how that line has shifted a little bit higher to peak at 73.6%. That would have been a few years back looking more like 93.6%, but such has been the revisions. And so all in all, the market took this in their stride. If you flip over to the next chart, you'll see that the Rand reaction, at least initially, was mildly positive. We tested levels closer to around the 1810, 1815 level before it's gradually started to erode again, and I think the erosion took place for good reason. There's still quite a lot of risk in the system. If I flip forward to the bond market, well, the response was even more muted. So much had been priced in. We knew that there was going to be a debt relief of between 200 and 250 billion to come, and so the bond market responded quite muted in its fashion, which I think is generally a good thing. So if I just finish off with my last few slides, and it wouldn't be a presentation to TreasuryONE clients in particular if I didn't touch a little bit on some of our proprietary indicators on Rand, but so the first is more just a touch on our fiscal resilience score, just to show you that actually South Africa has not done too badly given the circumstances. South Africa was one of the better performing countries, believe it or not, through COVID. Unlike many countries around the world that opened up the spending taps and just splurged on COVID in an enormous fashion, which they are now struggling to recover from, principle of which would be the UK, for example. South Africa did quite a lot less, and as a result of that, the overhang wasn't as significant. So if you look at South Africa's fiscal score, which is the red line, we've increased slightly at the back, but what's happened is that the rest of the emerging market basket has actually come down to meet South Africa. South Africa hasn't deteriorated, the rest of the EMs have. So, whereas in the past you may have singled out South Africa as being a fiscal delinquent deserving of negative speculation, that's no longer true anymore. Other emerging markets have caught up, and in so too have developed markets. So developed markets have not exactly covered themselves in glory. So by virtue of the fact that South Africa almost stood still, the others have caught up to South Africa's performances. If you flip over one more, you'll see that the heavy lifting of resilience more generally in the economy is still being done by the Reserve Bank. Our monetary rectitude is right up at the top. We rank 4th out of 22 countries, but it's fiscal. We still rank in the bottom third. So there's a lot more work to do. But by virtue of the fact that others are coming down to our level, almost helps us climb the fiscal ladder, not because we're doing anything particularly brilliant, but because other countries are not performing as well. So in my last couple of slides, just to highlight that we ran the Rand sentiment indicator immediately after this budget, just to see if there had been any changes. It's still alluding to a phase of Rand strength through the latter part of this year. Now, that might be difficult to believe, and I completely appreciate that in the context of all the load shedding that's going on right now, this looks like it's not going to play out. But we've betted against this indicator in the past, and we've been embarrassed in doing so. So I'm just pointing it out that the professional market at this point in time is actually anticipating that the Rand will still strengthen later this year. Perhaps we just need to get over the hurdle of a lot of these risk events for the market to calm down and behave more normally. Equally, if I flip over and I look at carry attractiveness, it's just a reminder that we rank in the top quartile of carry attractiveness in the world. So in out of 22 countries, we rank right up there. And so don't dismiss South Africa and the ability of the Rand to make a recovery. Finally, ending off with our valuation charts, just to show you on the right-hand chart just how extended the dollar is in its overvaluation, and on the left-hand chart just how undervalued the Rand is. So we're already weak, people. How much weaker the Rand deserves to go, well, that I think is up for debate, I guess. I wouldn't bet on a rand weakening too much dramatically from here, unless we go through a winter of discontent and load shedding rises from stage 6 to stage 8. Well, that changes the picture somewhat, and I think it will change sentiment in the markets quite a bit. So that is the biggest risk to the strong rand view, but in the context of the budget, the financial markets took it in their stride. With that, Andre, I think I'm going to hand back over to you to see if there are any questions on what I've presented and answer them if I can.
Yes, I have a question, George. Thank you very much. What's being asked is, and I'd like to know the answer to that one, or your opinion from any of the three here, is were there incentives given in terms of generation, own power, to businesses, to individuals? Would they be able to sell? And I know that Mr. Gordon Lewis in Cape Town had certainly said he wants to buy power from people. But would people be able to feed surplus generation back into the grid? Is the grid open for accepting that? Because that would be low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
To pick.
And there have been some suggestions that opening it up for that reverse power into the grid could unleash as much as 2 gigawatts, 2,000 megawatts of power back into the grid, which would be fairly significant. So we have a precedent that's already been set in Cape Town by Mayor Hill Lewis. So we are watching that with interest. They are aiming to have smart meters ready that are bi-directional, that allow for electricity to be monitored going in as well as back out again. And those are, I believe, going to be ready for installation from around about mid-year. There's no doubt that Cape Town is going to be the test case, the test case for this. I suspect that other municipalities around the country are going to follow suit pretty quickly after that, because as you quite rightly pointed out, that is a low-hanging fruit. And very easy to install. I think they might need to look at incentives on switching to these smart meters, because I believe that they're fairly expensive. So we need to potentially look at that. And then perhaps NERSA also needs to have a look at perhaps incentivizing people to sell electricity back into the grid at this stage of the game. I think that would be welcome.
Thank you. A quick one to you. Something that I picked up during the budget speech by Mr. Godongwana was that he spoke quite extensively to the non-payment culture and the installation of prepaid meters to get rid of that non-payment culture. Impact on, from a political side, because that could mean that people sit without power for a while, and what would be the impact there?
I think there's perhaps a particular challenge with Soweto in particular, because that's where the sentiment against paying for electricity, or in sections of Soweto, a historical debt to Eskom. But in a lot of places, actually, people already use prepaid. I'm from a fairly rural province, the Eastern Cape, and most people I know have long since transitioned to prepaid. Here's the problem with Eskom's municipal debt, and it is that the rates revenue collection is really poor. And so what municipalities do is they take the electricity revenue and they use it for general service delivery, because the collection that doesn't actually happen is on rates rather than on electricity itself, because people pay for prepaid. This is one of the reasons the Constitutional Court ruled the other day that Eskom can't switch off electricity effectively to people who've already paid for it. So that is where the challenge is going to be. But in my own comments, I will talk about what actually the political solution to the municipal problem should be, because it's not on that end, it is somewhere else.
Thank you very much. Then I'm going to introduce you as our next speaker, which you are, because that's certainly something that I would like to hear, because also Mr. Godongwana had mentioned something about speaking to the municipality debt on that. So then over to Zongezu Zibi, more than 20 years of corporate experience, during which time he's been a communication and corporate affairs professional and a leader in diverse industries. Written extensively about South Africa's political system, economy, and social dynamics. So I think what's appreciated here is the interaction between the economics and the political side. So since 27, he's been consistent and a recognized voice for accountability, something that we lack in South Africa, good governance, nation building, and the creation of a dynamic, inclusive economy. So definitely would love to hear your opinion on a certain few things, especially surrounding the budget. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to try and keep my comments short. Look, the budget is supposed to be a real expression of a government's political priorities. In fact, the then Director General of the Treasury, Lesetja Kganyago, who's now the Governor of the Reserve Bank, used to write this in his preface to the budget review every year, or at least on one or two occasions. In that it provides insight into, you get the real sense of the state of the nation, because the numbers don't lie. That's the one thing. The second thing is the numbers express things in ways that the president in his State of the Nation address cannot. And personally, I always listen to the State of the Nation address with a pinch of salt until I see the budget, because I want to see what is actually funded and what is not, where the prioritization in terms of fiscal resources is going to be. So let me first talk about where I think we are. I think because with budgets, we always look at things in the moment in terms of what the finance minister has said today, or in this case, in terms of what the finance minister said yesterday, and whether we think the way forward is optimistic or not. But I'd like to take a bit of a long-term view into the rearview mirror and say that average annual GDP growth over the last decade is lower than the decade between 2002 and 2012, basically. And there is a reason for that, and that is from about 2008, basically, or 2009, we had this experiment in neoliberalizing the economy, as it were, and we saw the introduction of some people into cabinet. But it's important to just look at those metrics together. Secondly, the unemployment is back up at 2002 levels, after having fallen to just over 21% in 2007, 2008. And that's got to matter politically, because it informs some of what the government then prioritizes in terms of what it needs to do. We've spoken about debt to GDP ratio, where it was in 2007-8 and where it is now. And what we've done or not done with that 735 billion circa that was released into the economy over a 3 to 4 year period as a counter-cyclical measure to the global financial crisis then. What we did is that's what kicked off state capture. It was a competition for that money, because that money is supposed to go into SOCs, basically public investment, basically. So some of this lag that George was talking about is money that should have gone into political actions, political and administrative actions at national government, in provinces and municipalities, that was squandered, wasted, stolen, misdirected, and so on. And we're feeling the consequences of that now. And then the municipality is a bedrock of service delivery to businesses and families, have all but collapsed. And I'll talk about this later on, because it really is important. Every business is in a locality. So if we can't get the municipalities right, the majority of municipalities right, in particular in the high economic activity areas, all of what the finance minister is saying about what needs to happen and the way they direct spending and so on is almost inconsequential, because there is this drag on what the economy is able to do due to the standard of the political management at that level. So I'm reciting these to remind you and myself that as skillful as the professionals at the Treasury and various government departments may be at producing a budget that keeps our coffers functioning, it is the political choices and actions that really matter in the long term. I remember when Minister Ibrahim Patel joined cabinet in 2009, he said the rand was too strong. It was 7.20 rand. And COSATU were blaming the rand strength for high unemployment and so on, Well, where is it now? 18 rand 10 cents. Unemployment is at 2002 levels. I'd like to have a conversation with him and say, so what do you think the score is now on your theory? See if the finance minister or the government is going to take the kind of bold step that is needed. But I will talk shortly about why this is not enough from the president as well as from the whole government as a whole. I had expected between 280 to 300 billion, but I think 253 is a really decent number. I'd like to take you up on George on these conditions. I looked at them and I thought, so let's say they don't do it, then what? Switch the lights off. You understand why the political follow-up or the political commitment is absolutely critical, because it's actually not up to Treasury to put those conditions in place. It is up to the government to make sure that you've got oversight, a mechanism, and the quality of people at Eskom who can actually do what Eskom is supposed to do. Because I'm not sure that the government can say, well, you haven't done it, you're not happy, switch the lights off. They can't. This is why there is this 253 billion rand debt relief package. So I've spoken about the debt relief, but here's what was missing for me. So I'm going to start juxtaposing 6 points and then I'll shut up, between the fiscal action as well as what I feel is a political juxtaposition. The fundamental problem, I believe, and Eskom's response to the DA application as well as Treasuries, touch on something that is politically sensitive, which is the revenue allocations in the multi-year determinations by NERSA are unhelpful. They are too low. They are too low. I was once part of the energy intensive users group when I worked in mining, and consistently over the years, the EIUG's submissions to NERSA were always closer, still below Eskom, but far higher than what NERSA eventually decides. So telling Eskom not to borrow, on the one hand, I don't want more debt to accumulate, but on the other hand, saying nothing about the price of electricity, which is below peer-to-peer and global benchmarks, is unhelpful. It's unhelpful, and that's a political gap I feel that is missing. It's not for the finance minister to deal with those issues, but for the president and all of cabinet, basically. And secondly, I also note that the president inexplicably asked Eskom not to implement the tariff increase, which they cannot yet, because in any case, NERSA has not actually made a determination on pricing guidelines at a retail level, because it's a two-stage process, effectively. There's a revenue allocation to Eskom, and then there's a determination on what the different pricing tiers are going to be, dependent on income and location and so on. And I think that the president should be stating the obvious and be honest about the government's own view of what a pricing path that puts Eskom on a sustainable footing should be. Again, I feel that these matters get left to the finance minister to deal with on the side of the table, but years down the line, we kind of, these things ring hollow in effect. The third point I want to say is that the price tag on transmission investment, actually, if I remember the number very well from Eskom's own transmission plan, is 144 billion. Now George referred to it being a good thing that the private sector is able to come in and do this, but actually this should be said boldly at a political level, not kind of hidden somewhere in the budget, because it is important to begin changing the orientation of how South Africans and the ANC think about policy making. Because part of the reason it gets said in this way is to give an impression that no, we're not giving things over to the private sector, but it's being forced by fiscal conditions that the government has to do this because it doesn't have the money. And the fourth point is that we also feeling the brunt of what the Auditor General has said for years, and that is Eskom is feeling it, and that is this has morphed the maladministration into an income statement hole larger than 60 billion for Eskom, which is what municipalities owe. Now, what I expected or would have expected the president to do is to say what is going to be done to put those municipalities on a sound administrative footing. Because otherwise, how do you solve the problem? You can't solve it on the Eskom end, because you have to solve the whole problem. Because George and Dr. Yamin referred to infrastructure that's collapsing at local level and so on. Of course it is. It's not just about electricity. it's about the rest of the other infrastructure too. So let me tackle 3 further topics together as one point, and that is Transnet, policing, and in the broader law enforcement and prosecution, fighting organized crime. These gangs are not just in the construction sector. Some of the cable theft at Transnet is to force some of that cargo onto road so that then the people can make money. That's just how they operate. It is the same principle that you see in some metropolitan areas where the municipal buses are shot up so that people can use taxis. It's the same principle. So that potential descent into a gangster state is worrying for me, because this is beginning to choke critical sectors of the economy and the logistical infrastructure that we have. I was also, as a last point, interested in how the finance minister, at least in the budget review, they sidestepped the issue of the basic income grant because it has gained a lot of currency, and they only spoke about an unaffordable option, and they were referring to big. Look, where I want to compliment the finance minister and the government is that, notwithstanding all of these pressures, with an election coming up next year, they have avoided a populist budget. And that's got to account for something. In fact, we spoke about earlier, I think it was Dr. Yamin who spoke about the mandate of the Reserve Bank. Actually, the die was cast in October. If you go back and read the medium-term budget policy statement, the die was cast there. Basically, nothing is going to change at the Reserve Bank at all. I think they also know that their comrades don't read these things. So by the time the ANC conference happened, the die had been cast, and it has not changed in this budget statement. I do want to talk about an issue we haven't spoken about, and that is next year. If we look at the polls at Rivonia Circle, we've done some polling, extensive polling. The SRF has done polling, etc., and the ANC has done polling. There will be a coalition government next year. What we don't know is what the composition of that coalition is going to be. And how we understand the political center that roots South Africa's policy making is going to change in a fundamental way after next year's election. Now, it could either be an ANC-EFF combination on the one hand, the ANC and another smaller party, or it could be 7-8 opposition parties that have little inclination to understand this stuff to any level of meaningful depth. The same guys that we see in the city of Johannesburg may very well be in the union buildings, and that's really an objective possibility that could happen, because the ANC support is falling and all projections are that it will be under 50%. I think just in terms of our thinking about the future and how we game the scenarios, we have to take that into account, because coherence, and we complain about coherence in the context of the ANC, but coherence between 5, 6, 7 political parties could become really, really challenging. We might double cross that bridge when we come to it, but thank you. Those are my comments.
Thank you very much. I think some of the viewers might have seen me sitting with a smile when you made the comment about next year's elections, and we will have a coalition government. I smiled and was thinking that maybe when we get the long-awaited cabinet reshuffle, maybe we should get a coalition cabinet and see how it gels out over the next couple of months. Throw in a couple of ministers from other political parties and have a coalition government, a coalition cabinet. You've mentioned and touched on a few things and really highlighted how important it is to see the political and the economic side together.
Yeah.
And how dangerous it can be to almost take your Minister of Finance and call him then the Deputy President, making all the decisions, because it's not possible and it's not right to follow through. George, your comments on that?
Yeah, I think there's always a real interesting dynamic that exists between real politic and the financial resources of a country. And I'm speaking from experience here, having covered Greece when Greece went to its multi-year depression, and seeing how the narrative changed from one which was deeply socialist and remained deeply socialist for a long time through that 6-year depression, only for eventually to capitulate and go the route of a more capitalist solution where privatization became a reality, and where the government had to relinquish power in a lot of centralized industries. It had to relinquish power, and the long and the short of it was that there's potentially light at the end of the tunnel if we can go down that road. I just don't know whether South Africa, without the benefit of having an ECB and a sort of European substructure, if you like, has the political ability to mature enough to be able to make that transition. So that's the first point that I would kind of like comment on. So that for me is something that interests me. And then, just listening to what Songezo was saying, it's very clear to me that we talk about coalition politics and whatnot going forward, and Joburg has been a bit of a disaster and it hasn't worked out well. Is there, just throwing this back to you, Songezo, is there any possibility of, and should I even be talking about the possibility of rigging elections?
So this question comes up a lot. I mean, there's always a possibility, but I think we've got such a noisy and watchful civil society. And I was in the Defend Our Democracy conference last year, and already then that topic came up. And over 60 organizations agreed, including community and church groups, that we must be particularly vigilant around election integrity. I think a bigger risk that we have is the risk of assassinations, because the possibility of people losing the kind of influence they have over the state. So take the Andre de Ruyter interview last night, right? And what I understand was said in that interview. The possibility of political change displaces the political crime syndicates that are so embedded in state-owned companies, basically. Because that's what political change means. The deputy president is different, so the deployment committee looks different, or there is no deployment committee. The person who appoints the boards of companies is different. And that existential threat, together with the fear of arrests, raises the possibility that these elements might start eliminating people they see as a political threat. I think that is a far bigger risk, especially where you have a police force that is unable to police, basically to effectively deal with all sorts of organized crime anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's a devastating indictment on how far politically South Africa has slipped, that we're talking about it in these terms. But is there a credible political alternative other than the EFF? The EFF, to my mind, has struggled. It captured a disenfranchised, more militant sort of portion of the electorate, but it seems to have topped out a little bit. Is there a more credible alternative other than the DA? Because the DA is also, well, it's maybe enjoyed a little bit more support now, but is there a credible alternative that we can look forward to in the next elections, which may throw a spanner in the works? A political alternative that can maybe capitalize on the fiscal position that we find ourselves in, the Eskom revelations that we've come to understand. Is there a political party there that's capable of doing something with that opportunity?
Look, let me answer this question carefully, because I do have a personal interest in the question, so I'll answer it in an intellectually honest way. There is no single political party that will capture the majority next year. There isn't. And if I was one or all of TreasuryONE and Econometrix clients, I would rather look like at what does the ideal coalition look like? Who would you like? Which combinations would you like to see in that arrangement, and what their orientation may be? I think with opposition parties, my disappointment has been an almost complete lack of interest or understanding of the national level macroeconomic issues. Let's take the DA's application to court. In all honesty, what are they asking for? And 0% increase for Eskom? That's not sustainable in real life, right? We might be having a tantrum because we don't like a combination of stage 6, 7 load shedding and a tariff increase, but what else do we do? So there's a lack of maturity that worries me, but it's not too late. Not too late. There is still a year to go between now and the election. And I think if I were to advise anybody who is in a large corporate investment firm, this is the time to stop the obsession with just the ANC. Because you're going to be dealing with a lot more actors next year. And you don't want to be scrambling to try and find out what they think, how they think about the economy, who the minister potentially can be, and so on. To better understand and measure the political risk that we face, I'd be talking to a whole lot of players and understanding how they think about the economy, about policy in general, and so on. And I think out of those conversations, the cross-influence between the different actors in the political economy starts taking on a more mature tone that we otherwise would have. But if you still beat your path only to Paul Mashatile, you're going to get a big surprise next year when the ANC gets 42 or 38%. Because and then what?
And is there the possibility perhaps of greater accountability because we've got all these different actors now playing a significant role within government? So the ANC no longer has the ability to corral the factions, if you like, to all be rowing in the same direction and synchronizing their efforts such that there is an outcome, a desired outcome for themselves. Now that we have this prospect of a coalition government, does that improve the situation? In other words, in your words, does it dislocate the existing actors enough that it upends a lot of this corruption, or does it just morph into something a little different?
Can I add to the question? Can the outcome be, in some respects, any worse than it currently is?
I mean, potentially it can, but I don't think it will be. Potentially it can. And let me put it this way. In the 2021 local government elections, 28 million people out of 41 million didn't vote. 42 million did not vote. Most of those are actually ANC-aligned voters. They've simply decided not to vote for the ANC. The difficulty of South Africa's political evolution and transformation is that the opposition in the form of the DA, the EFF and so on, have just not been able to swing ANC voters away from the ANC far enough for them to vote for something else, in effect. And unless there is a concerted effort to create another alternative to capture about 4 or 5 million votes, which is circa between 15 and 20% of the seats in parliament, the coalition arrangements become really complicated because you've got 3-4 kingmakers. So who collapsed the coalition in Johannesburg? It's Cope, right? And you've got that chaos there. Here, where we are in Tshwane and Pretoria, we don't have a mayor at the moment, right? And that's what happens with these unwieldy large coalitions. So the ANC space remains unoccupied by an alternative. That's a process I'm personally involved in, but I think it's important that you bring back a block of South African voters, ANC voters in particular, from abstaining back into active voting, because that increased turnout in the election does have an impact on an underperforming ANC in that its support falls and the nature of the opposition changes.
So if I listen to everything, then it says to me, the political parties and politicians, there's got to be mature.
Yeah.
Look beyond their own party and personal interest.
Absolutely.
And focus on the macro picture of enhancing the environment for South Africa,
Absolutely.
make it favorable to investors, and get a change in sentiment from your local inhabitants of the country.
Absolutely. I know politicians' job is to get votes, but I think the future of the country is so much more important. And I think that is where, for me, that conversation between economic and political actors across different parties is so important. Because we've all got to want to protect the same thing. The consolidation that has started happening now is absolutely critical. We must sustain it. And secondly, we need a strong collective political center so that you can continue to fix the institutions, the police that we're talking about, municipalities, and so on, because that is the undergirding of good governance. And it's important that all the key actors don't look at policy in terms of very narrow and parochial stripes, but look at the macro picture and say, how do we save and advance the whole?
Okay. So if I look at our discussion and I look at the budget and I look at everything, then I think our Minister of Finance had tried to strike a balance yesterday. I think if I look at a SONA speech from the President, he had mentioned certain things. I think from a budget point of view, it complemented a lot of what the President said in his SONA. Eskom still remains the absolutely critical and vital kingpin in this whole thing. If that doesn't work and that doesn't come to fruition, then all falls over. But I think in giving something to the individual and giving something to businesses to assist Eskom in generation and getting more independent, I think there's another message that comes very clear through all of this is the state needs private enterprise. And I think it's been said many, many a time. And I think the budget speaks to that as well. And I think as all of us are individuals in this country and business, I think the time has come that we actually take hands with government and we start trusting each other and make something of this and move forward. So we're at the end of our presentation. Dr. Razir, a closing comment from you.
Precisely what gives me hope is that, and to some extent George alluded to this, is that notwithstanding all the problems that we have been facing, and they are huge, this economy has not collapsed. We're still doing our work, carrying on. It's not as great as it could be, but it hasn't collapsed in the way George alluded to Greece. I mean, that was total depression when business contracts by 20, 30, 40%. We haven't seen that happen. It's not great, but it hasn't happened. Why? Because we are a very democratic society. There are valve mechanisms everywhere for people to actually express themselves, and you have people carrying on doing their own business, going on finding new ways, new innovative ways of actually managing, and the economy keeps plodding along. And I think George summarized it beautifully by saying I think where the hope lies is that we are gradually seeing the man in the street, the ordinary person with his own aspirations, gradually going to take the cudgels himself and find solutions in his own little environment to whatever's going on. And in the context of that, you will see a gradual diminution in the power of state-owned enterprises and the assumption of more and more of the responsibility for keeping the country going and the economy going in the hands of individuals. And I also detect a secular diminution in confidence in politicians more generally. To some extent, this is a worldwide phenomenon. And so that process in itself will generate its own dynamic that can enable the country to survive and then go forward into a new phase of growth and prosperity. There is one imperative that we have to watch here, though, and we have to somehow enable it, and that is to improve the levels of education and the ability of the majority of people to think for themselves and what is necessary, and to have a broader perspective than just to concentrate on saying, well, I've been brought up in an environment where I have to support the ANC, and therefore I will continue doing that. And that's what gives me hope. And when I'm asked, how long is this all going to take? I say, look, the next couple of years are going to be tough. Make no mistake. There's likely, I'm quite excited by the idea of a coalition government, and I think it could open up new opportunities, but it will also, there'll be a lot of chaos and upheaval in the process, which will be troublesome. But looking beyond the next couple of years, I do believe there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that in the correct environment, you'll get people doing, taking up their, getting up on their own 2 feet and providing solutions to our problems.
Thank you. Zongezo, I'm giving a moment for you as a closing comment.
Now, my closing comment is that this time may be really challenging, but it could turn out better next year and into the future. I think we just need to, like I said earlier, always look at the macro picture, look at all the players we need to agree for a national consensus, and make sure that we continue to focus on the critical things that matter. Have really difficult conversations when we need to, such as the fact that electricity needs to cost a bit more, unfortunately, if we are to sustain Eskom. And if we continue to have honest conversations about our problems, then the future doesn't look so bad. But we must stop this habit of burying our heads in the sand, feeding ourselves the Kool-Aid and hope the problems go away on their own. We have to stand up, face to them, get into a room with people we don't like, have the argument, and walk out with consensus.
George, your closing comment.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, if this was a message that could ever get through to government, it would be, please, just do the basics right. Get your law enforcement right so that there can be accountability. Get your education right so that we can render more people employable and relevant. Get local government working so that service delivery happens. Just do the basics right. It's amazing what the private sector can accomplish if just left alone to do what it wants to do. Stop interfering, get out of the way, shrink your role, allow the private sector to play a bigger part in this country. We're very fortunate that, and I keep saying this, and I'll keep saying it, but I think we were blessed with a very well-crafted constitutional democracy, a very well-crafted constitution, and it's protected this country through some very, very dark days, and I think we must be thankful and grateful that we had something like that, or I think it could have looked a whole lot worse. I look at other countries around the world that have turned into dictatorships like a Turkey or a Russia or a China or others, and the result is not a good one. These are not countries you necessarily want to live in. We still want to live in South Africa. It's a great place to live in. It's got amazing potential. We've just got to do the basics right.
Thank you, George. Well, to all our viewers out there, thank you very much for joining us today. To my guests, thank you very much for being with us, for sharing your views. We appreciate that. We appreciate the support. And we'll keep you updated throughout the year. And as last words, let's take hands, foster our partnerships with government and private enterprise, look each other in the eye, have the tough discussions, and look forward to the light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.